So welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. This is a seminar in the HELE, a webinar in the HELE series, and I'm Richard Smith from the University of Warwick, and we're sitting in the ELT archive at Warwick, and I'd like to introduce to you our speaker today, and this is Hilary Kalisman, and Hilary is a tenured associate professor of history and endowed professor of Israel-Palestine studies in the program in Jewish Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Her research and teaching focus on colonialism, state building, and history of education across the Middle East. Hilary's first book, Teachers as State Builders, Education and the Making of the Modern Middle East, published by Princeton University Press in 2022, and it won the History of Education Society Outstanding Book Award. And Hilary is currently working on a new book, analyzing the history and politics of standardized testing in Jordan, Iraq, Israel, and Palestine. And Hilary is with us here in the ELT archive at Warwick, where she has been researching for the last few days. We've been very happy to welcome you, Hilary. Over to you.
Thank you. Here I will share my presentation. Okay. So I would like to thank Dr. Smith, Dr. Vanilla, to ANET, to the HELE India Group, the ELT Archive here at the University of Warwick, the HELE Society and the Holt Research Circle at Warwick University, as well as the A.S. Hornby Educational Trust for sponsoring this talk and webinar. I also wanted to thank the Gerda Henkel General Research Grant Scholarship, which is allowing me to do research in the United Kingdom in general. So this brief discussion comes from the third chapter of my current book project, which looks at the history of standardized testing in the Middle East. It's very much a work in progress, just to let you know when watching this talk. So when I discuss standardized testing, I use a very broad definition. Tests that extend beyond individual grades or schools, that are taken under the same conditions and with the same materials available, and that are administered across a population of students, comparing them to the same standard. So this can include government exams, university entrance exams, and English language certification exams. They can be oral, written, or both. The main criteria is that they are applied in a standard way across different populations. So a 1945 report on British Council activities in Iran, Iraq, and Syria asserted that, while it may be unavoidable during initial stages to concentrate on the preparation of students for overseas examinations, e.g. Cambridge Certificate and London Matric, there is the definite danger of making these people believe that the passing of examinations is the be-all and end-all of education. The worship of the examination fetish, which was similarly fostered in other countries, e.g. in India and some dominions, is very hard to eradicate once it has taken hold of a people. So the condescension of the phrase, "these people notwithstanding," the British Council from the 1940s until the present has found itself in the position of encouraging populations worldwide to take standardized tests. So the British Council's 2024-25 report, the most recent available, is much more pessimistic than the previous year's report. As the chair and executive write in their introduction to the report, we are operating in a world shaped by intense geopolitical competition, technological disruption, climate crisis, and profound cultural shifts. They argued, however, that the key to addressing these complex challenges is trust, an area in which they asserted the British Council plays a vital role. The main areas of success emphasized in this report were focused on soft power and cooperation. The report noted the bringing together of 15,000 students from 108 foreign countries who had studied in the UK, the Going Global conference in Nigeria, which included different educators, ministers, and government officials, as well as several grants and partnerships focused on gender equality. The report then touted its achievements in standardized testing, describing the more than 2 million people who took UK school, professional, and university exams in over 100 countries that year. Indeed, of the total income of the British Council in 2024-5, the income of the Council from teaching and exams came to £702 million out of £1,010 million, nearly 70%. As the article on the left notes, many people, in this case in Malaysia, think the British Council's main or only purpose is to provide a location for, to study for and to take English language certification exams. The British Council itself was founded in 1934. It aimed at combating fascism while promoting goodwill towards Britain. The Council hoped that if individuals abroad had a better understanding of an ideal of Britain and Britishness, they would likewise be more inclined to support Britain's foreign policy, whatever for the moment that policy may be and from whatever political conviction it may spring. The British Council was initially composed of civil servants and educators taken from throughout Britain's empire and was a quasi-governmental organization. It has functioned as a charity with a royal charter since 1940, as an executive non-departmental public body under the Foreign Office, and as a public corporation. It continues to promote knowledge and understanding of the United Kingdom, the English language, as well as mutual cooperation between the UK and other countries. As it was founded in the 1930s, the British Council spread throughout the Middle East during the 1940s. This meant council institutions and officials started their work in the region when Britain ruled over parts of it and continued after that control had ended. My paper outlines the particular and symbiotic relationship between the British Council, standardized tests, and English language teaching, which the Council gradually came to admit formed its bread and butter. My argument today has two parts. So first, I argue that from its inception through the 1980s, Middle Easterners' demand for English and internationally valid certificates helped push the Council to change its propaganda methods, from its preferred emphasis on culture to standardized examinations and teaching English courses. Second, I argue that this was a shift away from imperial power, soft or otherwise, towards a type of cultural influence driven more by demand than by the goals of its proponents. So histories of the British Council composed through the 1980s tended to praise the Council and to focus on individual Council members. Recent scholarship has connected the British Council to British cultural imperialism, as well as to the globalization of the English language. Scholars have traced the push and pull between ideals of high British culture that Council members believed in and their need to adapt based on a lack of funding, often unclear mission, as well as Britain's changing role on the global stage. For example, Caroline Ritter shows how British Council activities aligned with examinations. British Council troops performed plays based on the content of school exams. For example, giving 1 year 60 performances of extracts from Romeo and Juliet and Twelfth Night because those were the set texts for the secondary school exams in West Africa. Alice Byrne has traced the importance of the idea of cultural diplomacy as distinct from that of propaganda in British Council history. In their work, Assessing English on a Global Stage, authors Cyril J. Weir and Barry O'Sullivan describe the intertwined relationship between the British Council and exams globally, particularly the Cambridge and London matriculation and English language certificate exams, and how both the Council and these tests helped shape English language teaching. Building on these and other works, here I concentrate on British Council policies alongside their customers, the Middle Easterners who sought out the classes and certification the Council provided. While initially the Council's creators thought Europe would be a key arena of Council activities, due to German and Italian propaganda, priority was also given for political and strategical reasons to the Near East. The Near or Middle East was by no means the only region in which the British Council operated or operates. However, it has remained an important arena of Council activities. It also represents a useful case study to explore how demand shaped Council activities in a region where Britain had and lost military control. So first, I'm going to discuss a bit about the background behind the tests administered in Britain's Middle Eastern mandates and how testing as well as English language teaching functioned within them, and therefore what the British Council was facing when it first began to work in the region. Then I will discuss the consistent push from Middle Easterners for testing and for English language classes. So after World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain and France mandates over formerly Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Britain claimed present-day Israel, Palestine, Iraq, and Jordan, then known as Transjordan. These European powers were supposed to teach the mandates to be modern nation-states. In reality, the mandates benefited British and French strategic interests while facilitating political Zionism and the mandate for Palestine. During the Ottoman era, new forms of professional and school entrance exams began. However, extramural examinations, planned at least in part by governments, began during the mandate period. In all three all three of Britain's mandates, examinations allowed students to progress to higher levels of education and to white-collar employment. Exams were content-based and high stakes. All three countries also required English as part of the intermediate and secondary curricula, as well as those examinations. So Iraq and its educational system experienced the least British control of any of the three mandates. Its exams were actually modeled on those of France, due to the priorities of Sathi al-Husri, an Ottoman Arab pedagogue who implemented Franco-Ottoman methods of schooling. His goals were to rigidly centralize education, unifying school children's studies, experience, and indoctrination in his view of pan-Arab nationalism. Iraq also required all schools to administer Iraqi examinations, although they could administer foreign tests as well if they so desired. For example, the Jewish Shamash school in Baghdad taught Iraq's curricula along with French and English, preparing students for multiple examinations. The mandate for Mesopotamia, or Iraq, ended formally in 1932. However, Britain maintained control over various aspects of Iraqi policy through 1958, when military officers overthrew the British-backed Hashemite monarchy, beginning a series of dictatorships. Transjordan's educational system and its budget were small. It had a sparse population, and Britain restricted government spending to focus on Transjordan's military rather than on education. While there was little British interest in regulating curricula or examinations, the country only had one complete secondary school, which was just for boys, until 1946. Very few students reached a matriculation level, although more would take elementary and intermediate level examinations. So those students in Transjordan who did reach a matriculation level could take the Transjordan matriculation in the 40s, an adapted version of the Palestine matriculation, which I will talk about, or they would travel to Palestine itself to take British or Palestinian tests. Palestinians had the widest variety of exams available due to the diverse assortment of missionary and foreign institutions in the mandate, as well as government policies. This meant there was stiff competition, not only between schools, but between the tests those schools offered, including the London and Cambridge matriculation exams, as well as Palestine's own matriculation. Palestine's Board of Higher Studies composed and graded government exams. It also formed one of the few places in which Palestinian Arab and Jewish civil servants worked together on educational matters. Its members included Jewish, Arab, and British officials from the Department of Education, missionary figures, heads of schools of archaeology, and government officers and other officials interested in education. Exams could be taken in any of the mandate's three official languages, English, Hebrew, and Arabic. When setting up shop in Britain's mandates then, the British Council was entering a space in which English was already valued and certified through exams. As this article, written in 1962, you can see the English in the Middle East, notes, the matriculation exams of the mandate era had sparked a demand for English which outlasted the mandates themselves. So schools during the mandate period required students to learn English. So on the right, you can see an English language examination from the Arab College of Jerusalem, an elite secondary school, and this is from 1929. In Iraq and Transjordan, English formed a mandatory subject on upper-level examinations and a required course in most elementary and intermediate school. In Palestine, English was even more prevalent and important. From the 1920s, missionary schools prepared students for British examinations, including the Oxford and Cambridge certificate exams and those of London University. The London matriculation was held in Palestine since 1922. English also formed a shared language between British officials and educated Jews and Arabs in the mandate. However, this meant the British Council had to compete with or form partnerships with other organizations that promoted English language teaching. Despite the prevalence of English language subjects in British examinations, not only in the Middle East but across Britain's empire, colonial officials were often frustrated by colonized populations' desire for exams. Arthur Mayhew, a famous colonial official, complained in the 1920s, just as the Indian education system was gaining independence from Britain, of, quote, an excessive emphasis placed on passing examinations and the direct link between an overriding academic curriculum and the creation of a white-collar class. He uses a nastier term that I'm not using. Rather apologetically, he asserted, there is no country which has so far discovered a harmless substitute for this necessary evil, here referring to exams. Mayhew argued that examinations and their ills exemplified an Indian culture of schooling concentrated on education for government employment rather than for character building. Scholar Sanjay Seth argues that in India, allegations of cram were linked to a discourse of instrumentalism. British observers faulted their Indian subjects for memorizing vast quantities of material to be regurgitated on exams in order to gain government posts and better marriage prospects, rather than seeking education to better their morals and character. These critiques echoed colonial fears that education more generally would lead to nationalism and therefore to rebellion. On the one hand, exams reduced the number of students advancing to higher education, which British officials tended to view in a positive light. However, the idea of exams as a means of gaining employment rather than building character seemed to the officials to be an unfair and uncomfortable use of education. The legacy of colonial education, specifically the fear of colonized populations using exams in an instrumental way, shaped the work of the British Council in the region, even as Britain's military hegemony came to an end. So during World War II, the underfunded British Council asserted that their work must be more than, quote, that double horror of a phrase, cultural propaganda. In order to promote British culture and goodwill towards Britain, the Council deployed different tactics. These included lending libraries, traveling lectures and stage companies, films, subsidizing the study of English children at English-style schools abroad, English language classes, and finally examinations. In comparison to the efforts of France, Germany, Italy, and later the United States, Britain spent much less time and money on soft power. Instead, the Council complained, Britain was hoarding, quote, a body of knowledge that the rest of the world needs must seek to prize from us like pearls from an oyster, while we on our part remain deaf to the lessons to be learned from all but the most familiar of our neighbors. The British Council had faced two problems since its inception. First, convincing the British government and public that its work was worth funding. The nebulous idea of cultural propaganda and its use in improving relations between Britain and other countries was hard to quantify, particularly in the midst of outright war and/or decolonization. Secondly, the Council had to find other means of supporting itself, as the British government was often unwilling to spend funds on something so vague as cultural promotion, or so dangerous as educating colonial or imperial subjects. Moreover, from World War II, and particularly after Nazi Germany's conquest of France, Britain was the dominant imperial power in the Middle East. This did not help its popularity. Arab nationalists voiced frustration with Britain's continued involvement in Iraq and Transjordan, having set up monarchies in both countries who were amenable to British interests and expected to receive British funding. Britain also supported Zionism and Jewish immigration to Mandate Palestine, which spiked after 1933 due to the rise of Nazism in Germany. British forces brutally suppressed the Arab revolt in Palestine in 1936-9. The White Paper, which Britain's government put in place in 1939 after the revolt, sought to placate Arab Palestinians by restricting Jewish immigration and land purchases and promising full independence to Palestine in 10 years with an Arab majority. It had the added outcome of not only preventing Jews fleeing the Holocaust from legally immigrating to Palestine, but also angering Palestine's Jewish community, pitting a formerly supportive group against Britain. In the Middle East, the Council had focused its energies in part on creating spaces for elite locals to mingle with British officials and to watch English language media and performances. However, it became very clear that simply presenting British high culture or founding various clubs could neither keep the Council afloat nor make up for Britain's unpopular involvement in the region. In Iraq, for example, the British Council's social club, founded in 1940 and based in Baghdad, had boasted Iraq's unpopular regent and pro-British prime minister as members. Less than a year after its founding, the council staff had to retire to the safety of the British embassy as British forces swept into Baghdad, restoring the monarchy and removing pro-Axis Iraqi leaders. British council officials had tried another more elite-focused tactic as well, an attempt to found a school similar to that of Victoria College in Egypt, a British public school-style institution, but in the Middle East. You can see one of the documents discussing the possibility of the school on the right. First seriously proposed in 1940, the school was to be established by the British Council under charter from the Iraqi government with adequate guarantees against interference. Mr. Morey, the British Council representative in Iraq, wrote, We must take a long view. Our object is to influence the governing classes of Arabs in the post-war world, and not merely to introduce a little more English into what is admitted to be a thoroughly unsatisfactory system of education. His more specific criticism was that the school they hoped to take over, Faisal College, was unsuitable because it was too Iraqi, and because its curriculum followed the Iraqi government school secondary syllabus. The school itself never materialized. However, when exams were the primary purpose of British Council institutions, they fared better. In 1941, the British Council partnered with the University of Cambridge Local Examinations Syndicate. The council not only helped develop Cambridge English language exams, but also offered locations for students to take these exams and courses to prepare students for the tests as well. The prestige of Cambridge University helped sell exams. More practically, recognition of this certificate in England, as well as the fact that the British Council was a place to take the Cambridge and London matriculation exams, helped draw students to the council, when promises of tea, Shakespeare, and tennis did not. For example, at the Institute in Baghdad in 1942, the council offered courses for the Cambridge Certificate of Proficiency in English to Iraqis, paying the tuition for 30 schoolboys from the state secondary schools who failed their English exams, as well as additional English classes for Polish troops that were stationed there. These activities appeared more popular than the sociability the Institute had sought to cultivate. In Palestine in 1945, the British Council founded the Jerusalem Institute of Higher Studies, which they described as a relatively peaceful place, and one which from its inception was focused on exams. The Institute prepared students for the Cambridge examinations in English and English literature and offered tuition for students taking the University of London matriculation and intermediate exams. The British Council report of 1945-6 noted optimistically that throughout the difficult times in Palestine during the last year, Jews and Arabs of both sexes have studied together with no apparent feeling of mutual hostility. Indeed, it is generally felt that in the atmosphere of this school of higher studies attended by men and women of the younger generation, racial and political feelings are not allowed by the students themselves to intrude. I think this was likely overly optimistic. But the staff itself included Jews, Arabs, and Englishmen, but was always headed by British academics. Everyone's degrees were proudly displayed in the school's yearbook. After World War II ended, the council was working to justify its existence and financially support itself in the face of austerity measures. In 1945, Britain's Labour government shifted the British Council from the Foreign to the Colonial Office. There were budget cuts, particularly in the Middle East, and political circumstances which forced the closure of British Council facilities. The British Council scrambled to prioritize their activities, seeing which would need to be scrapped or changed. At first, they ended subsidies to British schools and elementary level teaching in favor of secondary school level English teaching. They also closed the British Institute in Kirkuk in Iraq due to the institute's focus on social functions and cultural activities. As the British Council report argued, this institute existed laterally chiefly by virtue of its educational role, and few benefited from it except the students who came to learn English. In any case, the institute in Kirkuk could never hope to succeed as a means of bringing Iraqis and British together unless it could attract the Iraqi Petroleum Company from their luxurious seclusion. What we see here then is an attempt to create a pro-British sociable upper class. We also see this attempt failing due to the political and economic conditions unique to Iraq. Specifically, the IPC housed elite British and other foreigners who did not deign to participate in many council activities, lowering the social standing of the council in that area. Middle Easterners also valued the very scant scholarships offered by the British Council and the opportunities they granted to study in the United Kingdom. Nicola Ziada, who you can see in the photograph, an Arab-Palestinian historian, recalled the orientation required by his council scholarship for postgraduate studies, which he felt he didn't need, as he had already spent 4 years in London on a mandate government scholarship. He nevertheless loved his time at the University of London studying for his PhD in history, although he lamented that many of his peers were unprepared for cultural differences, which he felt the orientation meetings, which really just focused on the ins and outs of rationing food, did not help. Scholarships like those Ziada received ranged from 2 to 3 for the whole country of Palestine at any given time during the 1940s. This meant individuals who received these scholarships tended to be intellectuals and authors as well as educators. However, in Palestine, the British Council also spent scholarship money on less august cases, for example, giving the children of British parents scholarships to attend approved schools. Even as Britain withdrew from the Mandate for Palestine on the eve of Israel's War of Independence and Palestinians' Nakba or catastrophe, the British Council facilitated examinations. The British were to leave Mandate Palestine, and the territory was, according to UN Resolution 181, to be divided into a Jewish and an Arab state, with Jerusalem as a separate international enclave. Bernard de Bunsen, Palestine's last director of education, who you can see in the photograph, wrote of his concerns that the withdrawal of British troops with partition would mean the closure of all British Council centers in the proposed Jewish state. What is uppermost in our minds is the continued cultural links between England and Palestine after the political link goes. On political grounds alone, it is of the highest importance to ensure the continuity. From my experience here, I am sure that both Arabs and Jews look primarily to English institutions for university and technical training. However, according to de Bunsen, the most urgent question at the moment was the external examinations which we have been conducting on behalf of British universities and specialized institutions, with some 2,250 candidates per year. As he noted, London University was concerned about their matriculation and intermediate exams, which were to take place in July of 1948. Moreover, there was the, quote, equally important question of carrying through our Palestine matriculation examination, accepted as the equivalent of matriculation by all British universities, also due in July, with 550 or so candidates, mainly Arab. We shall inevitably have to ask you to take over the responsibility for the administration of this exam too, though, as you know, there is a Palestine Board of Higher Studies directing policy, which we must attempt to keep into being. By May of 1948, Mr. de Bunsen had left the country, having transferred the examination section of the Palestine government to the British Council, with the hopes that they could run the tests, despite the impending war which partition would bring. While it proved impossible to hold external examinations, like London University's matriculation, the British Council nevertheless employed some of the examinations department staff of the Palestine government in order to deal with exams cancellations and to administer and grade the last of the Palestine Board of Higher Studies exams. One Arab examination officer was forced to work out of a hotel bedroom in the Jewish area due to security reasons, and the conditions for taking these exams were dire. However, students were able to take these tests even within a war zone, due in no small part to the British Council. What we see here is first the Council acting as an arm of a British-controlled government, even when that government had ended. We also see it providing exams as an important way of maintaining ties between Britain and areas it no longer controlled. Over time, the British Council focused more and more on examinations and on English certification. Into the 1950s, the Council continued to downplay elite social clubs and performances in favor of teaching English. A 1955 report argued that the purely cultural work, art, exhibitions, visits of orchestras and theater companies, though it produces tangible and growing results, is about 2% of the Council's budget. The main stress is on teaching and visits, teaching English and encouraging and helping people from overseas both to come to Britain and to get the maximum advantage from coming here. By 1956, there were 25 institutions which taught English and held examinations worldwide. As the Council report that year noted, in many countries, a powerful incentive to the study of English is the fact that it is now possible to take recognized British examinations in the subject, leading to qualifications which are rightly prized. The most widely held are those of the Cambridge Local Examination Syndicate. In the 1950s, thousands of candidates sat for these examinations, as well as those from the University of London and other British bodies. In Israel in 1959, a Hebrew newspaper noted that the British Council Institute in Tel Aviv was floundering because it was no longer a serious learning institute, but rather a social club, and not just for persons of high rank. Finally, courses such as shorthanded typing were introduced, apparently in a desperate attempt to gain a foothold among students. In the past year, the number of students has dropped from 60 to 40, such that they have even discussed closing the institute. However, the article emphasizes that English exams at all levels were still available to be taken at the Council. So here you can see the Institute faced difficulties when its target audience viewed it only as a social space with insufficient practical value. Its English language teaching and administration of English language exams kept the Institute afloat. Locals also saw the exams as a means of social mobility. For example, a Hebrew language article entitled "How to Get a Higher Education Without a Rich Father" described how Palestinian citizens of Israel took exams conducted by the British Council, not only matriculation exams, but also the exams of the British Engineers Association or exams for a graduate degree of the University of London. These exams, conducted by the British Council, give graduates recognized degrees not only in Israel, but all over the world. The Arab educational system in Israel was separate. The need to learn Arabic as well as Hebrew, in addition to Jewish religion and a Jewish nationalist history to pass Israel's university entrance exams, meant it was more difficult for Israel's Palestinian citizens to pass. While those in East Jerusalem and by 1968 the conquered West Bank and Gaza continued to take exams from Arab countries, British exams also offered a means of circumventing Israeli universities, along with the opportunity to study abroad. One thing I've also seen is that examinations and their importance to the council seem to increase over time. So early British council reports barely mention exams, despite their prominent connections to the Cambridge Syndicate, but by the late 1960s, they begin to acknowledge the importance of exams, describing them as ways of ensuring the quality of English language teaching and in making sure that students matriculating at British universities had the requisite understanding of English. Into the 1970s, the Council highlighted the importance of examinations in creating a positive view of Britain and of English due to the value and integrity of British examinations and the continued demand. One of the issues around this, though, was to make sure it was profitable. Administering exams could be an expense, but students preparing for these exams tended to take lessons from the Council and to pay fees to take exams at the Council. Exams also increased interest and participation in Council lessons and programming. As sources written by Middle Easterners emphasized, the main benefit of the Council was its English language certification. Into the 1980s, Middle Easterners' discussions of the Council concentrated on its language exams. For example, in Jordan's Al Dastur newspaper in 1988, there was a celebratory article on the British Council Institute in Amman and its historic role in Jordan since 1948. The article emphasized English language courses, including more general and specialized courses, and the necessity for exams in order to prove English language proficiency, particularly for students who wanted to study abroad. The language exams Jordanian students could take at the British Council included the GCE, TOEFL, ELTS, etc. Testing sessions were held twice a month, and as the article emphasized, were difficult and required courses for preparation. The article helpfully pointed out the costs of the English courses that necessary to pass exams could vary, and it had a separate section discussing the cultural benefits of the Council, arguing that since 1948, the Council has spared no effort in promoting and enhancing cultural, educational, and artistic cooperation between the two countries. The main focus of the article, however, is English language testing. Similarly, in English, this 1985 poster proudly proclaimed that there is no need to go to England to learn English anymore, and noting that places are limited at the British Council. While earlier Council posters had referenced arts and books in English, by the 1980s, the importance of the Council was focused on it as a place to learn and be tested in English. Perceptions of the British Council within Britain, or at least in its official documentation and criticisms, focused on its desire to sell culture. One rather acerbic 1955-6 report described how the Council's critics ranged from the extreme wing who associate the name with long-haired young men, continually sending Morris dancers to the Fiji Islands, or to the tolerant but apathetic majority, who imagine the Council as a highbrow corporation specializing in a luxury called culture. Legitimate, perhaps, but not strictly necessary, like a mink coat or a Rolls-Royce. The Council described itself as a cultural organization, to be disparaged as unnecessary or vague, rather than fulfilling its purpose of increasing positive feelings towards the United Kingdom and towards a particular ideal of British culture. However, when looking at the Council's constituencies in the Middle East, even with this very cursory look, which requires much more research, it's clear the Council offices were successful when they offered exams and classes that would allow students to succeed on those exams. We also see how the Council was created as part of a British imperial project, but lingered after Britain's physical control of the region had ended. As one 1950s report on the British Council's work in Jordan described, in the long term, the British Council can do more for our prestige and influence than any of our other agencies, provided it is directed on practical and sensible lines. The particular field in which the British Council can play an effective part is by the provision of good instruction in English and the teaching of English ways. This should stand us in good Instead, even after our direct political influence and the physical presence of British forces may have been greatly reduced or have disappeared. British forces withdrew from Jordan in 1958. Britain could, however, maintain a type of cultural influence, specifically through English and through English language tests. The Council contributed to the spread of standardized testing in British English through its catering to local demand for these services because of the tangible benefits they brought people in the region. To my mind, this is a different notion of soft power than that of British cultural imperialism, as it's driven by Middle Easterners' goals. The British Council embraced the instrumentalism of English and examinations, breaking with past colonial ideals of schooling for character and of restricting English and British influence to elites. I'm happy to answer questions. Again, this is very much a work in progress, so any suggestions or corrections would be very appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Hilary. That was a really interesting talk. I'm sure there are questions from the audience online. You can write any questions you have. You can indicate with a hand if you like, or by unmuting yourself if you'd like to ask a question, or make a comment. British Council, of course, has been instrumental in India, and you may want to. Many of our listeners are in India. You may want to relate it to your own experience, or yes. Would anyone like to ask a question? Oh, yes, Nick. Over to you then.
Hi,
Unmute.
Hilary. Thank you very much. That was really interesting, and for me personally as well, because your kind of argument is going in the opposite direction of the one I've been trying to make. Although I'm looking at Europe and in a very different context than what you are. But one question I just wanted to ask, just in general, is how much of the impact of this was to do with demographic change in general? So you mentioned the secondary school in Transjordan in the 20s. There was just the one, and it was for boys only until, what was it? I think 1946, you said. So, but then after that, there was just globally, there was not only an expansion in terms of population, but also in terms of like mass education. So the influence of like United Nations, largely through the US, and then obviously the Cold War and so on. So what I'm trying to get is how much of that shift away from the social space, the very small kind of clique, where they're trying to do that kind of, Pax Britannica, kind of just getting in with the elites. I think David Cannadine has written Ornamentalism on a very, if you're familiar with that, on a very similar kind of topic, that kind of thing. So to what extent were they, in a sense, overwhelmed by the fact that once it expands in terms of actually the scale of numbers, that they can only be forced into offering examinations as their main route out, because the numbers that are actually now pouring into the, like mass culture, pop culture of, globally, in a sense, in that period, the post-war. So sorry, that's my
No, it's a great question. And particularly in Britain's mandates, and I actually wrote about this in my first book, is the second Britain is no longer controlling those areas' budgets, the budget for education skyrockets. Like in Iraq, it goes from like 6% to 25% of the budget.
wow. That's
So you can see colonial restrictions on education really clearly from that
mm, mm,
angle, but it's something where you're right, like the number of people who would be eligible to take secondary school level tests
mm,
expands to a huge degree. And I
mm,
think it's something I would like to think about more in terms of how much that's affecting it.
mm,
Because I would say what I've seen in the documents tends to be less of a discussion of like the number of people who are now like eligible for these type of tests and more about the sort of in a like, but maybe this is something where like these are no longer able to be elite spaces and that
mm.
they were generally not appealing to the elites in these countries anyway, or the British had sort of banked on elites who are then out of power with regime change.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think it's a really interesting question, and I think
Mm,
it must play a role in it. And I would say, especially if over time you're seeing a huge increased demand for these services, because there are so many more people who are able to take advantage of them, that would make sense to me. That's a really good question, something I want to follow up on in terms of the degrees.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may. So I think it's really interesting to have a case study of a particular area, the Middle East, and the issue of local agency as opposed to, I suppose, policy of cultural imperialism, um, is the issue here, the tension between those two, or the relationship between us. And I think you're emphasizing a local agency to want to do exams and maybe to want an instrumental view of English. And I think that's may change my mind to some extent because of your detailed local focus. I had been thinking of or seeing this shift from a focus on elites, which I can see in the development of the institutes, the British institutes, which the British Council was supporting very much around the world through the 40s, I think. I was thinking of it more as a development into the 60s, that there was a policy change. So I've looked more at the central documents, I suppose, and a definite shift towards a focus on mass education in the council and away from this focus on elites, and a shift towards English, teaching English for instrumental purposes as opposed to for access to British culture. So I've looked at that a little bit in the Indian context, but in terms of central policy, I've seen that as really imbuing British Council work in coming into the 60s. But here we can see it happening earlier. So that's maybe what we can see if we look more at a particular context. That's at least what my not really a question, but a comment on what you're saying.
Well, but I would say, I think what you're seeing in the areas I'm looking at is sort of not the overall change in policy, but the parts where the previous policy isn't working. So it would make sense to me if like the bigger changes happen in the 60s, but these are instances where they're trying these previous policies and they're seeing them not succeed.
Yes. So I'm starting to think of it more in terms of the changes in policy as a consequence of things being seen to be not working. So thank you very much for that new perspective I've gained. But I can see we've got a question from I think first was I can see that Vanilla would like to ask a question. Actually, before that, I think Prithviraj had your hand up. So Prithviraj, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you for the wonderful talk, ma'am. I was just curious to know of the role that British diplomats had to play in the work of the British Council, particularly in the period which you described in the beginning. And I was wondering if Lawrence of Arabia had to do anything with the work of the British Council in that period, because that was the high period when he was operating there and very much active in that period.
So I would say so Lawrence of Arabia is really important, like particularly for the study of like British relations with Jordan and also like British perceptions of Jordan, like until the present day. He precedes the council, but one of the things though you see in particularly Iraq and Palestine is British diplomats being expected to come to council functions, being expected to mingle with audience members, when Britain and that particular country are doing okay together, right? So like when the British diplomats are expelled, like the British Council has to figure out if it can stay even when the official British officials from the British government can't anymore. And so in Iraq, the council ends up having to withdraw on like a number of different occasions and then come back. And so I've been reading these documents, and a lot of them actually have to do with trying to recover council property that the Swedish embassy keeps for them, right? But so I would say, from what I've seen, that like British diplomats were meant to kind of elevate the status of the council. But I don't, but again, it shifts based on the relationships between the country and Britain's governments over time.
Thank you, Professor Hilary. That's such a lovely talk. And what struck me most was when I was listening to you talk about the Jerusalem Institute of Higher Studies. You talked about how both the genders were included, students from both the genders. That's very remarkable for that time, I'm presuming, 1945. But the other two contexts of Iraq and Transjordan, they were a little more restrictive. How did women really access these spaces, these examinations? That's something that's very intriguing for me.
It's something I've been trying to figure out as well. So, like the systems of education in Iraq and Jordan and in Palestine for the Arab population were segregated by gender. Like, sort of, and then when you get the state of Israel, like the Palestinian schools within the state of Israel become co-ed in part because there are so few schools like left in this area, and in part because this is the way sort of like the Jewish community of Mandate Palestine has had co-ed schools, other than more religious Jewish institutions. And so from what I've seen though, is that you would sometimes have English language teaching that would be specifically in girls' schools, but also higher levels of education in both countries were co-ed sooner than lower levels of education. So if you were taking like a Cambridge English language exam, the assumption is you would have gone past high school and that you would not be going to a single gender school after that. Sort of, you get the first like female Iraqi lawyers and doctors starting in the 20s and 30s. So it's something where like the space of the exams of these, sort of these exams would have been co-ed, and the assumption is just like, okay, like this is at this level that is more acceptable or more necessary. But it's a good question. It's not something I've seen come up in people's discussions of the exams, in part because most of the people I'm looking at were people who were taking exams where you would have like were taking more like the local, like the Iraqi exam or the Jordanian exam, and then you would have taken it at your school, and it would have been with the population of your school. But it's a good question to think about how they structured this. And again, I do know women were taking these upper level exams.
This is a lot for even the HELE India group to think about. That's a wonderful trajectory.
Thank you.
How would you relate it, Vanilla, to the Indian context?
I think so. There's a lot of nation building going on at that time, and a lot of women were into missionary medical training, and that is a lot well recorded, well chronicled. The medical mission colonial Indian women, but I haven't really heard or read a lot about how they figured in the English pedagogy. In fact, that's one trajectory that's ongoing in HELE India Hornby supported project now, about how Indian linguists or English ELT origins may have happened, and how did women figure in this. That is one trajectory, in fact, we are all involved in right now. But assessment and examinations, that's not really what we have started to look at. This is a very new, interesting direction for our thought too.
And I would say also missionary schools that were single sex would also prepare girls for exams. But again, I think the expectation was you were taking the exam in a co-ed environment.
Yeah, Amal, you've got a question.
Just a personal curiosity, so to say. For a long time, well into the 20th century, 1938, if I remember correctly, large tracts of Middle East, all the way to Jordan, Amman, and Kuwait, were part of the Indian British Empire. So in your archival research and explorations, did you come across a long hangover of the British operations in Indian education system and policy and practice impacts in the Middle East?
Yes, and also personnel, right? So you would have people who, sort of had like either, the previous generation would have worked in India as a colonial official, but when British colonial officials in the Middle East are talking about education, they always talk about India and then Egypt. And they see both of these as complete failures. Right? So basically, they say, like in India, we taught everyone too much English, and then they rebelled against us, right? And so then in Egypt, and because they talk about having tried to teach people along the lines of a British education, but then, sort of the result isn't one that increases the stability of the British Empire. So they're unhappy. And then in Egypt, they say, okay, we're going to fix it this time. So we're going to limit English to a very elite few. And we're not going to teach English in rural schools at all. And so you create a completely bifurcated system of education, one of which tends to often be Islamic too, with like Al Azhar at the peak of it. And then you have one that has English, which allows people to go again, like to this Victoria College, which, or, in Alexandria that they see as a big success. But then also in Egypt, sort of right at the end of World War I, you have rebellions against the British also, right? Like you have huge nationalist protests, which are led by the former Minister of Education. And so they say, okay, education along these lines did not work at all. And then they're like, okay, and now we're suddenly in control of these other areas of the Middle East, but let's do the same thing, right? So they also try to separate out English and try to have a rural versus urban syllabi. But they don't have the finances or the will to kind of sustain it in the same way. So this actually means there's much less of a difference between rural and urban syllabi. But no, they very frequently reference India and India's education over and over again, and they're very explicit that that's sort of a model they're looking to, but also one that they think failed.
Thank you. You did say one interesting thing there. British officials kind of feeling that they taught too much of English to Indians, while recent developments in history of education in India is building this argument that Indians did not rely too much on the official support and mobilized lots of local and native support and resources and taught themselves English. So was there a similar kind of movement there in the Middle East? Though demand was there, as you mentioned earlier, but self-help kind of thing?
Yes, and again, as I mentioned, the second anybody gets control over their own educational systems, like you have sort of you have an increase in the number of like people going to school that's exponential. Um, but again, English is retained, like even in Iraq, which again has like strong control of over the system, and the sort of Iraqi citizens in control of it thought the English school system was completely incompatible with Iraq. They thought that, the American school system was completely incompatible with Iraq. Some of them actually liked it. They have a lot of fights. But again, they keep English and they fight to keep it. So I do think you see like a story of people teaching it to themselves, trying to circumvent the restrictions on the system. And again, when people get control of it, more people get educated.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So, yeah, are there any more questions? It's been very fascinating.
Oh, I see the chat one.
Oh, in the chat, sorry, yes.
from
Would you
Monal.
like to say the question and answer?
Sure. So I ended up choosing this topic because I interviewed a lot of people who went to school in the Middle East for my first book about their teachers. My first book is about public school teachers and their social and economic status and how it changes with politics across the region. But every single person I interviewed talked about the standardized tests they'd taken and whether or not they passed and what their scores were. And so I sort of was really interested because it was so important and because it seemed to be playing so many different roles for governments versus for the people taking them. And so some of the challenges I've faced are the very different accessibility of documents on this subject. So for me, doing research on the British Council and the National Archives in London is like the most relaxing thing ever. There's a catalog and you order from it and you come in and you sit there and they give you the documents and it's very straightforward. Whereas I'm trying to get a hold of reports from Iraq for the 80s and it's very difficult. It's not accessible to me. Again, certain places are more accessible to me than people from the region. I can go to Lebanon, although not right now. I could go to Israel, I could go to the West Bank, but other places like Iraq are less accessible to me. So one of the biggest challenges has been trying to find sources. And the comment, the pearl and the oyster. So basically what this British Council report is kind of complaining about is that like we have all this, wonderful knowledge to give to the world and we're not sharing it, right? So it's like the oyster is clamped down on all of this wonderful knowledge and they have to pry it open. And the reports have really fun language. I would say I've been enjoying reading them.
Yeah, we can't see the questions. Who was the question from?
Monal.
Sorry?
Monal.
Monal, thank you, Monal. And thank you for your response, Hilary. So hopefully you've enjoyed our archive.
Very much.
Although it's a little bit disorganized, not quite as well organized as London, but you've been spending 2 days there, and
No, it's very nice.
We've really enjoyed having you here, and we've all really enjoyed your talk today. And I hope you'll keep on, in contact with us and maybe join some of our webinars sometimes.
I'd love to.
And fantastic. Thank you so much, Hilary. And we're going to say goodbye, everyone, today.